On Egghead, Luffy faced the Elders for the first time. Immortal foes, far too powerful to defeat, forcing a desperate escape. But what if he had stronger allies? What if, alongside Dory and Brogy, Shanks himself came to help? Back on Egghead, Luffy's group met the real Vegapunk at last, and soon found out about his goal to give the world unlimited free energy. But now the government wanted him dead because he had been studying forbidden history, the Void Century, the same history that had gotten Ohara destroyed. But soon enough, things would get dire as Lucci and his group reached the island and sent it into chaos with help from York, who planned on supporting the government to become a celestial dragon. If that wasn't bad enough, Admiral Kizaru was close to arriving as well, with 9 vice admirals and none other than Elder J. Garcia Saturn himself. The Straw Hats were stunned with tons of new information, but there was no time to dwell on it. They were trapped on an island where they were being hunted by York, the Seraphim, CP0, and soon the full force of the world government. As Saturn and Kizaru closed in, Egghead was about to become a full-blown war zone. The tension on Egghead Island exploded when Kizaru finally arrived. His light-speed entry shattered the sound barrier. With one blinding flash, he was on the battlefield and had quickly defeated Sentomaru, with the rest of the Marines coming onto the island as well. As the fighting spread, the Straw Hats were still scattered. There were too many enemies to deal with. Luffy himself jumped into the fray to fight against Kizaru, and he had enough strength in Gear 5 to keep him at bay, which caused a certain something to open its eyes on the island. But things went from bad to worse when Saint Saturn arrived on the island with a magic circle and took the Seraphim and Pacifista under his control. He himself had transformed into a massive Gyuki-like demon. Egghead Island was burning. A buster call had been initiated on it, and Vegapunk's original body, the Stella, had been fatally wounded by Saturn before meeting its end from Kizaru's attack. That's when things changed. A transmission began playing, sent all across the world, a transmission in which Vegapunk was going to reveal the truth of the world. Panicked, Saturn created 4 demonic circles around him, and soon the 4 elders began appearing from them. Marcus Mars came in the form of a giant bird demon. Topman Warkery turned into a huge boar. Nusjuro turned into a skeletal horse of death, while Jupiter turned into a huge sandworm. Now, all 5 elders stood on the island. The Straw Hats regrouped, battered, and out of breath. Others held off the Seraphim, while the rest tried to protect Vegapunk's satellites. There was no escape. The entire island had been surrounded. The world government's strongest forces were now all in one place, all to wipe them out. Luffy kept fighting in Gear 5, his hair flaming white, his body stretching in cartoonish ways. But even he was beginning to slow down. He smiled, spun, roared, and launched massive punches. But his enemies weren't slowing down. They kept regenerating from each wound. But then, they suddenly felt something. The sea exploded with wind. The waves rose, and the island was suddenly bombarded with Conqueror's Haki that made everyone stop in their tracks. It wasn't just strong, it was massive. A surge of Conqueror's Haki, unlike anything seen on the battlefield, rolled across the ocean like a storm and slammed into the island. With the force of 1,000 kings, soldiers collapsed instantly. Seraphim froze. Even the elders suddenly felt a tinge of fear as the Haki seemed to penetrate their souls. Luffy turned to look at the coast, and that's when he saw them. Red sails. A ship had closed in on the island, followed by another, much larger one. But it was the smaller ship that most of the Marines recognized instantly. It was none other than the Red Force. Shanks was the first to step on the island as Luffy looked toward him. Behind him marched Dory and Brogy, the legendary giants from Elbaf. Their giant axes gleamed under the sun, and their laughter echoed across the sea. They stepped onto the battlefield without hesitation, each stomp shaking the coastline. More of Shanks' crew followed. Ben Beckman, Lucky Roo, and Yasop, all calm, collected, and deadly. Shanks stood tall at the front, his cape blowing in the sea wind. His eyes shifted from Luffy before locking onto the elders. The battlefield seemed to pause for a second as everyone felt the shift in power. In the next second, Shanks had dashed and was now standing next to Luffy, staring down the elders. On the other side of the field, the elders were clearly enraged, filled with fury and worry. The broadcast was still playing, and even though they'd narrowed it down that the Den Den Mushi transmitting the signal was inside the giant robot called Emmet, they couldn't take a single step, not right now, with Shanks standing in front of them. Shanks slowly unsheathed Gryphon, his eyes on the elders, as he told Luffy that it had been quite some time since they'd met. He told Luffy that he'd done well to keep the elders at bay, but also that it would take a bit more to harm them. Luffy had already had a difficult time dealing with the elders due to their regeneration. He had been hammering the elders with Gear 5. Punches spun like drills, bounced like hammers, and twisted like rubber blades, but nothing had worked. Every time he knocked one down, it rose again. Their bodies healed. Their flesh reformed. Their power was endless. But then Shanks told him that there was a way to keep the elders down. In the next instant, the battlefield erupted in chaos again as Shanks moved too fast to follow. In a single motion, he swung his blade across the battlefield as he dashed forward. He aimed straight at Saturn, and the blade shimmered with advanced Conqueror's Haki. Black lightning snapped and cracked through the air, shattered the ground beneath him as Shanks' sword cleaved through Saturn's legs, slicing 2 of them clean off. And this time, they didn't grow back. Saturn hit the ground. For the first time since arriving, he screamed, not in rage, but in pain. Real pain. He clawed at the dirt. His wound sizzled, the black Haki still burning into his flesh. He tried to regenerate again, but nothing happened. Luffy stared in shock. He had never seen the elders like this when he was trying to fight them. It seemed impossible to even slow them down. Shanks calmly glanced at Luffy and nodded. Luffy understood. This fight was not just about strength anymore. It was about hockey. Excessive Conqueror's hockey. That was the only way to push back demons. Luffy grinned and tightened his fists as Ben Beckman stepped near him as well. Lucky Roo had attacked St. Topman Warkery, with Yasop providing supporting fire from the distance. Warkery kept regenerating from the wounds, but the two pirates were effectively keeping the Elder at bay and distracting him. Meanwhile, Ben Beckman fired a shot towards St. Marcus Mars. The bullet flew fast like a railgun, glowing black and red as it seemed to explode into the Elder's wing. It was as if advanced Conqueror's hockey had been compressed into a perfect shot. When it struck Mars's wing, the Elder did not shrug it off. He staggered. Then Ben fired again and again as the Elder tried to dodge the bullets and heal himself. Mars roared, slashing at trees, rocks, anything nearby, but Ben was not there. He was already behind him, firing again. This time, a shot pierced the back of his leg. The red hair pirates were not just strong, they were abnormally focused. Other members were taking on the Marines while Dory and Brogy were clearing paths through the chaos. Kizaru approached the two of them, and they began fighting against the Admiral. For the first time since the Marines had invaded, the tides were turning. Luffy shot back into the sky, lightning dancing across his body. He pumped more hockey than ever before into his arms. His fists enlarged, glowing white. His heartbeat picked up from the excitement. As Emmett was going at the other elders, Zoro soon reached the two and began supporting Beckman's attacks. Sanji, Nami, and Usopp were dealing with other Marines. The crew had begun fighting back as well. The Straw Hats were not alone now, and when Luffy punched Jupiter with hockey practically erupting from his fist, the Elder actually bled. He began regenerating a bit later, and Luffy understood that he needed to work on his hockey. But this was enough to slow them down at the very least, and the enemy had learned something terrifying. They could bleed. Luffy bounced into the air, twisting his leg into a coiled spring before slamming it down towards Saturn's head as Jupiter had left for someplace else. The Elder raised an arm to block, but Shanks was already behind him. A red slash of Conqueror's hockey erupted across Saturn's back, opening a glowing gash that did not heal. Saturn screamed and spun, his leg lashing out like a whip. Luffy ducked under it, grabbed the leg mid-spin, and slammed Saturn into the ground, bouncing him like a ball before hurling him into the sky. Shanks jumped upward and met Saturn mid-air with a crushing vertical slash. The blade did not just cut, it burned through Saturn's energy, severing a leg mid-flight. Then another opponent clashed with him, Noosejuro. Shanks defended himself with Gryphon as Noosejuro slashed at him, and the shockwaves seemed to shake the island. Noosejuro did not hesitate, and he charged Shanks at full speed, swinging his blade with monstrous force again and again. The air between them cracked. Lightning burst between the blades as black and red hockey clashed, tearing apart the clouds above. Luffy did not wait. He stretched himself backward like a slingshot, then launched a giant dawn punch straight into Saturn's chest before he could support Noosejuro. The punch pushed Saturn through 2 layers of concrete and sent him skidding across metal platforms like a ragdoll. It was slow, but the Elder could still regenerate from the punch. Noosejuro turned, but Shanks was already moving. He dropped low and spun his sword upward. The slash cut deep into Noosejuro's skeletal leg. Noosejuro grunted and backed off, stumbling, as Shanks advanced. Now it was 2-on-2. Luffy and Shanks, Saturn, and Noosejuro. And the worst part for the world government was that Emmett was still in working condition. The broadcast kept playing, revealing secrets about the clan of D, the fact that they were the ones who had consistently rebelled during the Void Century, and as such, were the enemies of the current world government. The most outrageous reveal, though, was that the world government was going to go through with something known as the Great Cleansing by sinking the world even further and creating a utopia for just themselves on the massive bridges they were building. Before any further information could be revealed, St. Peter turned his attention toward the robot as soon as his wound healed and went right through him, finally ending the broadcast. But too much had already been revealed. While Emmett was on his last legs, he finally used the one weapon Joy Boy himself had provided him with, his own hockey. Emmett undid the rope and a burst of Conqueror's hockey spread across the island that was even greater than Shanks. The 4 elders Saturn had summoned had their summonings undone, and they were forcefully removed from the island. Every other Marine on the island had been knocked out, and now the only ones remaining were Elder Kizaru and Saint Saturn himself, who had been heavily wounded from his fight with Shanks. The Elder was on his knees. Even in his demon form, he could barely stand, with most of his legs cut off. Luffy dropped near Shanks as the Emperor had a few final words with Saturn. Saturn stated that this was not going to be the end, and cutting him down was an even greater sin than leaving the Celestial Dragons. Shanks was told that he would have to cut through his own father and brother if he continued down this path, but the Emperor said nothing. He simply stated that their time was coming to a close as he slashed Saturn's neck, slicing it clean off. Instead of regenerating, the demon's body began to dissipate, and soon there was nothing left. And finally, the island had quieted down. Vegapunk's final message, the one he had been trying to send to the world, had not been fully transmitted, but the information that was sent out would be devastating to the world government. The feed had reached every corner of the seas. The truth about the Celestial Dragons, the will of D, and the lies buried by the world government were no longer secrets. Kizaru disappeared without a word when Joy Boy's hockey had been unleashed, but a majority of the Marine forces had been knocked out and were lying on the island. The The red-haired pirates began gathering them up and chaining them, while the Straw Hats, wounded but alive, gathered at the edge of the ruined lab. With the war on Egghead finally over, the seas fell quiet. Shanks told Luffy that Vegapunk's message would bring about a massive change in the world, but right now, they should continue their journey. Luffy was to be taken to Elbaf, where he could find more information. Shanks said that they could finally catch up before they parted ways in Elbaf. But little did the two know, Elbaf was going to become a war ground. Shanks stood beside Luffy on the Red Force, watching the horizon. With Egghead behind them and the message out, there was no turning back. The world's balance was shifting, and so they headed for the land of warriors. They soon reached the massive island. Elbaf stood tall, wrapped in storm clouds, its forests towering like mountains. The giants welcomed their visitors with massive drums and laughter. Dory and Brogy, already heroes among their people again, led the parade, and soon the gang started exploring the island, learning more secrets from the Void Century. Robin reunited with Saul and found the old books from O'Hara, and news spread about a certain prince who had been chained up in Elbaf's underworld. But in the shadows, something else was at work. Unseen by the giants, the God's Knights had already moved. Figureland, Shamrock, and Gunko arrived on Elbaf using a summoning circle in the castle, and soon headed straight for Prince Loki. The message from Vegapunk had created massive turmoil all over the world, and people were rising up against the world government. Many Marines had also defected when they found out the truth, and now things were in dire straits. The elders already intended to get the giants on their side, but now they had to succeed with this operation because the risk of massive rebellions was too high, and there was no hope of using the ancient weapon used to destroy Lelouch because they couldn't get York out and thus had no way of replicating the mother flame used to power the weapons. The elders had failed. Now, the balance of the world would be restored, not with diplomacy, but with force. The first step for Shamrock and Gunko would be to look for Loki, the fallen prince of Elbaf. They came to offer Loki the chance to become a member of the God's Knights. Out of every giant on that island, the strongest one was Loki, having inherited the blood of the ancient giants from his father, and the man capable of wielding Ragnar, the legendary hammer of the giants. They couldn't have expected that Shanks and Luffy would both arrive on the island so close to their own arrival. There was no time to waste. While the Straw Hats met up with Scopper, the left wing of the Pirate King, the God's Knights made their way to the underworld to recruit Loki. But the prideful giant simply refused them, and as a gift, he was left mortally wounded. Now they had to summon reinforcements. There were a few important objectives the God's Knights had to achieve. They had to either recruit the giants or make them subservient, and they had to destroy the library on the island, which harbored knowledge that may be even worse than the knowledge Vegapunk revealed to the world. To do that, they decided to kidnap the giants' children to make them subservient. But the fact that two emperors were here meant that Shamrock and Gunko would need more reinforcements. As such, Shamrock summoned Saint Summers, Saint Killingham, and 3 other God's Knights. Word was also sent to the elders that Luffy and Shanks were on the island. The elders had already been beaten by the two emperors, and they knew the threat they posed was too significant to ignore. At this point, their presence on the island meant that Shamrock and the others might not be able to go through with the mission. And if the giants were left to fight, the world government would soon be overthrown. Raids had already begun against them, and their forces were dwindling fast. It was time to shut down at least 2 of the threats. The target changed. It was time to kill both Luffy and Shanks. As the elders were coming up with plans, Emu soon shifted into view. The true ruler of the world was disappointed in the elders for not taking care of the problem and letting it escalate to this point. He had no need for useless pawns. As such, in an unexpected turn, the hidden ruler sapped the power from the elders and reduced them to skeletal husks. All their age caught up with them in an instant, and they were instantly decimated. Emu then called upon St. Figureland Garling, the leader of the God's Knights, and bestowed on him the power he had sapped from the elders, including immortality. They told Garling that they planned on personally going to Elbaf and that the new elder would join them. It was time to take care of the thorns in their side. Emu then created a magic circle and transported both himself and Garling to Elbaf, and a pressure was suddenly felt on the island. Shanks and Scopper instantly felt it, and so did Luffy, who was currently with Zoro, healing Loki with the other giant pirates. It was a pressure similar to Conqueror's Haki, but it felt much darker. The giants began gathering, and non-combatants were told to take cover and hide. Everyone knew that something menacing had landed on the island. Emu unfurled his wings and took to the sky, slowly floating toward the giant village where the warriors and most members of the pirate crew were at. Shanks looked up at the devil and unleashed a burst of Conqueror's Haki that clashed with Emu's own. It seemed to shake the entire island. Luffy hurried with unbinding Loki, who had healed up quite a bit, and even the accursed prince felt the power in the air. Things did not bode well. The sky bent around Emu as the two Haki canceled each other out. Light dimmed. Even the warriors of Elbaf hesitated. The God's Knights formed ranks. Their leader, Shamrock, looked toward Shanks and loudly proclaimed to his brother that he happened to have made enemies with the wrong people and that even he himself wouldn't hesitate in ending his brother's life. Garling told Shamrock to quiet down before telling Shanks that there was still time to switch sides. He simply had to back down and allow them to subjugate the giants and the rest of his crew. Shanks simply laughed and unsheathed Gryphon as Shamrock unsheathed his own blade, Cerberus. The red-haired pirates gathered around their captain as the giant warriors took up arms. This was not going to to be an easy fight, with most of the allies unable to wield Conqueror's Haki. As the red-haired pirates and warriors got into position, Shanks was the first to lunge toward Emu, who had summoned a magic book. Garling clashed with his son using his own blade, and the clash sent tremors across the battlefield. The battle then erupted on a full scale. The God's Knights had unbelievable strength, and their regeneration meant that at this point, Scopper and Ben Beckman were the only two people who could properly wound them. Apart from Shanks himself, they desperately needed Luffy in this battle. Meanwhile, Luffy was making his way up after convincing Loki to fight with him. They had learned of Loki's past, and Luffy had chosen to believe that Loki wasn't the bad guy and wasn't the one who had killed Harold all those years ago. The gang left the underworld and headed straight for the battlefield. Emu himself had begun to use a technique called Domi Reversi, which had turned a few giants into massive demons, much greater in strength and size than their already huge builds. The God's Knights were gaining significant boosts, and Garling was keeping Shanks away from Emu. But finally, Luffy and the rest reached the battlefield. Luffy leapt into the sky and went right after Emu in Gear 5. Meanwhile, Loki swung his massive hammer at the God's Knights fighting against the other giants. His attack actually connected, and the Haki filling it significantly damaged the knight who had been hit with the full brunt of the attack. Loki himself had incredibly high levels of Conqueror's Haki. Luffy's arrival split the battlefield. The air itself twisted as he rocketed skyward in Gear 5, his silhouette bouncing between lightning clouds and waves of smoke. His smile returned, a smile full of defiance and freedom. Emu looked down calmly as their wings unfurled, the black grimoire glowing in their hand. They tried to suppress the rage building inside them over the man they deemed the reincarnation of Joy Boy, their former enemy. Luffy struck first. His fist collided with a magic barrier surrounding Emu that cracked under the pressure of sheer will. The explosion of Conqueror's Haki forced both armies to stagger. Below, Loki crushed one of the God's Knights with his hammer, shattering the ground in an arc of black lightning. Scopper and Beckman flanked the giants, each targeting the regenerating knights with precise Haki-infused strikes that slowed even the strongest among them. The rest of the crew was holding the knights at bay while Zoro was clashing with St. Summers. But in the sky, Emu transformed. Their wings spread wider, tail lashing, horns growing from their forehead. A massive trident formed from the black abyss in their hand, spinning and reshaping like liquid shadow. The grimoire flipped open, summoning weapons from the void. Cannons hovered in the air. A giant black pistol locked onto the battlefield below. Emu fired. The shot pierced through the air and severed the arm of a giant warrior, then began piercing many others, friends and foes alike. Luffy dodged the attacks aimed at him and began destroying the weapons Emu was summoning. His friends were endangered, and his Haki kept growing stronger at that thought. He wasn't going to let this monster hurt his friends. Below, Shanks had locked swords with Garling. The former Celestial and the red-haired pirate danced across craters and shattered stone. Garling's immortality seemed to be much stronger than the Elders, but the regeneration was incredibly slow with Shanks' Haki-infused cuts. Shanks had begun timing his strikes, dodging, countering, and finding the openings, and Garling was clearly being pushed back. Then, Shamrock joined his father as two other God's Knights distracted Ben Beckman. Shanks increased the speed of his attacks and began pressuring both his brother and father. He was an absolute beast, and he felt no love for the kin who had stooped so low. The fight went on as the battlefield raged, but soon enough, Shanks disarmed Garling and kicked Shamrock back before piercing his father through the heart with Gryphon coated in Haki. Garling coughed blood as the Haki infused his heart, shutting it down. Shanks had a solemn look on his face, trying to push back the pain of having committed patricide. As Garling collapsed, Shanks took the sword out and looked up at the sky where Luffy was clashing with Emu. It was time to support Luffy. The pressure around the battlefield dropped for a moment, but it wasn't over. Emu used Domi Reversi again, spreading abyss circles across the battlefield. Dozens of warriors began to sink. Two corrupted demons already stood at either side of Zoro and Jinbei. Zoro slashed through one, coating his swords with armament and Conqueror's Haki. Jinbei struck the other with Fishman Karada, but it was too late. Another wave of warriors turned. They had trouble dealing strong enough blows to the warriors to drop them unconscious without killing them. Across the field, Loki swung his hammer and struck the earth, sending out a burst of Conqueror's Haki that seemed to disrupt the God's Knights. The converted giants paused as well. Loki turned toward Emu and leapt. His hammer collided with one of the abyssal cannons midair, destroying it in a burst of sparks. Scopper joined him from below, cutting through two God's Knights in a sweeping arc. Beckman stood behind them, firing Haki-infused rounds at their regenerating limbs. Emu was descending, their wings burned with black flame, their body massive, their trident fully fused into a living weapon. They descended toward the battlefield like a falling god, summoning an abnormally large number of weapons as darkness began to cover the sky. But Luffy wasn't done. His fist grew to massive proportions. He struck the circle with a white-hot punch, shattering it mid-cast. The darkness recoiled. Emu turned surprised for the first time since arriving. Then Luffy and Shanks stood side by side. Both of them had been wounded from the onslaught, but they weren't backing down. Shanks unleashed his final burst of Conqueror's Haki. Red streaks slashed the sky. Luffy followed, his Haki mixing with Shanks to strike towards Emu. The combined blast hit Emu squarely, and the darkness began to crack. Emu felt the force of Haki in their body, and the force caused some God's Knights to lose their regeneration. This was enough for Scopper and Zoro to cut through two of them. Emu screamed loudly from the pain and sent out tendrils towards Luffy, Shanks, and even the battlefield. The fight kept going, but it was clear that Emu was getting cornered. They had underestimated the two Yonko, and now they were paying the price. This reminded them too much of Joy Boy. It wasn't possible! The grimoire exploded into bright purple, and summoning circles began to form underneath the gods, knights, and Emu. Shanks and Luffy realized that the ruler was trying to run away and rush towards the tyrant. Emu looked at Luffy and Shanks with hatred in their eyes, and before the two could attack, they vanished. More than half the gods' knights lay dead. Garling was dead, so were Summers and killing him. Gunko was captured, while Shamrock and a few others escaped. But the heroes had won and driven back Emu. Mary Jawaz was already in flames from the rebellions, and now many of the world government's strongest assets were lost, with even Emu retreating. The battle may not be over, but this time, the shadow ruler of the world government may never recover their power. A new dawn was breaking. Subscribe and hit the like button for more One Piece videos.